These are the most interesting historical photos and unusual objects from the past. Let's get 100,000 subscribers. In 1904, icebreakers made the first passage of the Northern Sea Route, linking Europe and Asia across the Arctic. Their steel bows crushed sea ice while crews navigated drift, fog, and midnight sun, turning a map edge into a trade lane. In 1913, Ford's moving assembly line cut Model T build time from about 12 hours to roughly 93 minutes, reshaping factories everywhere. The pace was tough, so in 1914, the company added the $5 day. Early 20th century freighters sailed with little forecasting, and waves as high as a house could snap decks and strip a ship clean. After 1912, wireless SOS radios and the Plimsoll line became standard. Early steel bridges were assembled like giant kits. Crews walked bare beams and caught hot rivets in buckets, then hammered them in before the metal cooled. Their work tied rivers and railways into one network, cutting travel times by days. Miners once carried canaries because the birds sensed carbon monoxide first. If the song stopped, crews fled at once. In 19th century Britain, pits also used child trappers and hurriers as young as 8 to open doors and haul coal. An early 20th century crowd in Britain protests over compulsory vaccination with handmade signs, torches, and a police officer carrying a child. A storm rages as a signal operator taps Morse code by lamplight while a flare marks the line. In early 20th century wars, thin copper wires carried orders for miles, and lightning could turn the whole field into a buzzing radio. A powerful arc lamp turns a Paris hall into day as workers stand on the scaffold and shadows climb the glass roof. Early electric lights like this helped night searches and the first news photos of big events. A 3-horse ladder wagon leaps into motion as firefighters sprint through spray on the cobbled street. In the early 1900s, stations could harness and roll in under 20 seconds, and the thunder of hooves was the city's alarm. Women run jobbing presses in a hidden shop, turning out leaflets that fueled early suffrage marches. These quiet rooms could print thousands per hour, and one night of work could bring a heavy penalty. An early armored diving suit is lowered from the dock as a crowd watches, its joints sealed like a tiny ship. Built to walk the sea floor, it weighed over 300 kilograms and aimed for depths near 100 meters. Prospectors at a Klondike camp wash gravel through wooden sluice boxes while wagons and tents fill the valley. From 1896 to 1899, tens of thousands hauled nearly 1 ton of supplies over icy passes, turning Dawson City into a boomtown. A Pioneer biplane skims the grass as a crowd watches from behind a rope. Early air shows in the 1910s drew huge crowds and set new speed and distance marks. 2 wooden boats stretch a seine across the quiet bay at low tide. Japan kept set net and handline ways into the 1900s, mixing old craft with new engines. Miners stand face to face with uniformed guards outside the camp, tools in hand and rifles on the line. Coal strikes in the early 1900s helped win the 8-hour day and stronger safety laws. Steam trains glide into a London station as the new underground rewrites the city's rhythm. Opened in 1863, the first miles were dug as open trenches, then roofed, and carried over 26,000 riders on the first day. Wrapped in a blanket on a rescue ship, a survivor of the great liner sits in the cold dawn. Of 2,224 on board, only 710 survived, and the ship Carpathia reached them about 3.5 hours later, in water at -2 degrees. Matthew Henson and Robert Peary stand on the ice during their 1909 push to the North Pole. Henson reached the point about 45 minutes before Peary, yet broad credit came decades later. One man stands on a pile of wrecked boards as water covers Galveston after the Great Storm of 1900. The surge climbed about 6 meters, and the city later built a long seawall and raised streets to face the Gulf again. On August 5, 1908, the Zeppelin LZ-4 faltered in a sudden gust near the Rhine and caught fire before a crowd of about 40,000. Weeks later, donations from ordinary Germans reached 8 million marks to fund a new airship. Police form a ring around the Brown Dog Memorial as crowds of students and workers argue in London, 1907. The statue, at the heart of an animal testing dispute, was guarded day and night until it was quietly removed in 1910. Rescuers carry miners on stretchers after the Monongah mine blasts in West Virginia, December 6, 1907. It became the worst mine disaster in United States history. With the true toll unknown and reforms that helped lead to the Bureau of Mines in 1910. 16 white-painted battleships steam into port as crowds wave from the quay. From 1907 to 1909, the Great White Fleet sailed 43,000 nautical miles to 20 ports on 6 continents to show American sea reach. Shackleton's Nimrod party hauls sledges across the Ross Ice Shelf, stopping only 156 kilometers from the South Pole in 1909. They turned back and all returned alive, while other teams on the voyage climbed Mount Erebus and reached the South Magnetic Pole. In 37 seconds, the Messina quake of 1908 turned streets to rubble, with reports of 75,000 to 200,000 lives lost. 10 minutes later, a 12-meter wave swept the shore and finished what the shaking began. Suffragettes chained themselves to the Parliament rail in London, holding signs that say, "Votes for women and deeds, not words." Their campaign helped win national voting rights in 1918, with equal voting in 1928. A steamer heels on the shore as lifeboats launch, and a wireless man sends a call. In 1909, the message SOS from the ship Slavonia was heard hundreds of miles away, proving Marconi radio could save lives at sea. Families gather at the burned shell of Collinwood School after the fire of March 4, 1908. The loss of 172 children and 2 teachers led to new rules for exits, fire doors, and clear halls in public buildings. Farmers gather around a Ford Model T as it arrives in an Irish village in 1909. Made for simple roadside fixes with a few tools, it let people travel farther and often faster than the local train. Boston officers raised new light batons to guide night traffic on wet cobblestones. In 1909, electric wands and street lamps helped move both horses and motor cars safely through the dark. At Reims in 1909, the first international air meet filled the sky with biplanes racing and climbing before a crowd of hundreds of thousands. Glenn Curtiss won the speed prize, and Henry Farman set a long-distance mark, proving flight was ready for real contests. Foreign troops stand inside Beijing after the Boxer Uprising as the Qing court accepts a treaty with heavy payments and foreign garrisons. Moments like this, with prisoners under guard, showed how quickly an empire could lose face and set the stage for the 1911 revolution. Workers carve a huge trench under live traffic to build New York's first subway, boards and ladders holding the street up. From 1900 to 1904, the cut and cover work was loud and risky, and more than 50 workers lost their lives. Rows of young women sew at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York, with doors kept locked during long shifts. In 1911, a fire led to the loss of 146 lives and new safety laws for exits and alarms. In 1911, a German warship steamed into Morocco and sparked the Agadir crisis. The move almost drew France and Britain into a major conflict years before the First World War, and showed how fragile peace in Europe was. On 9 May 1911, a stage accident broke out during the Great Lafayette Show in Edinburgh. The crowd thought it was part of the act, and the delay cost 11 lives, including the magician. On 17 September 1908, a Wright military flyer crashed and marked the first loss of life in a powered airplane. Orville Wright survived with injuries, and the shock pushed early pilots to improve safety checks. In the summer of 1916, a string of shark incidents along New Jersey waters unfolded over 12 days and cost 4 lives. The scare rewrote expert views on cold water sharks and later inspired the novel and film Jaws. In September 1903, Philadelphia opened a curious school that taught parrots to speak with a phonograph. Mrs. Jacob Hope reportedly played "Polly Wants a Cracker" 1,000 times, and 6 months of lessons cost $40. In October 1906, 3 Belgian inventors unveiled a flying machine shaped like a giant wasp with silk-flapping wings. They reported a test flight, but no public show ever proved the orthopter, leaving a curious gap in early aviations. In November 1906, a Swiss court jailed a 3-year-old for 3.5 months for taking 2 penny toys. His words about having no toys like other boys later pushed calls to change how courts treat children. In February 1907, Harry Stilson won a bet by holding a headstand for 20 minutes with almost no hand support. He collapsed the next morning, and doctors blamed a rush of blood to the brain from the long inversion. In April 1904, a young woman in a green dress walked into Oshkosh City Hall and scattered dried peas, saying, "Peas mean something." She did the same at the courthouse and the sheriff's office, and the meaning remains unknown. In December 1901, a German traveler named Johann Beck could not afford a ticket and sealed himself in a wooden crate to cross the Atlantic. A long storm delayed the ship, his food ran out before land, and he stepped out weak but alive. In the early 1900s, guides in San Francisco Chinatown led visitors into opium rooms where people rested on carved beds. By 1909, more than 200 spots were open, and some officers were paid to look away, a quiet, open secret of the era. In 1911, British workhouses kept poor older people under strict rules, even splitting married couples. The death rate was about 3 times higher than outside, and many remains were sent to medical schools for study. At Ellis Island, doctors marked clothes with chalk: X for mind issues, E for eye illness, L for limp. From 1892 to 1924, about 2% were sent back, and many families were split for life. In New York's Tombs Jail, women were kept alone in tiny cells about 1.2 by 2.1 meters with no heat in winter. Meals were bread and water, rules were severe, and isolation could last for months with no hearing. In 1915 to 1916, Armenian families were forced from their homes and driven across the Syrian desert. Up to 3/4 did not make it. Many lost to thirst, hunger, and disease during the marches. Life on early German submarines was harsh. Months in a sealed steel tube with diesel fumes, damp air, and mold hurt the crew. Many returned with skin rashes and a deep cough and spent weeks in hospital to recover. In early 1900s New York, Bellevue used restraint jackets and hung patients from wall hooks for hours. Care then could include long, cold baths, feeding through the nose, and a spinning chair that made people faint. In early 1900s London, many seamstresses worked up to 20 hours a day in windowless cellar rooms for tiny pay. Fainting was common on the floor, and sickness such as tuberculosis shadowed every shift. Steerage on immigrant ships packed up to 2,000 people in tight rooms with bad air and few toilets. The 12 to 14-day Atlantic crossing often spread disease, and many were buried at sea before land. In early 1900s, Britain orphaned children in workhouses had shaved heads, rough uniforms, and 1 bowl of porridge a day. Many were sent to factories or mines for tiny pay, and many became sick, and some did not live past 10 in crowded, dirty rooms. In 1910, the Seine rose about 8.5 meters and turned Paris into a city of canals. The Louvre moved art in 72 hours as boats passed cafes and the metro became underwater tunnels. In the 18 and 1900s, some British asylums used a water cure that strapped patients in baths and held them under until they fainted. Doctors thought revival would end mental illness, but the method often had tragic results. Early First World War flamethrowers hurled burning oil about 18 meters and turned trenches into heat in seconds. Operators carried 40-kilogram tanks, and a single hit could set off the fuel with fatal effect. On 15 June 1904, The steamer General Slocum caught fire on the East River with 1,342 people aboard. Rotten life vests failed, lifeboats were nailed down, and over 1,000 lives were lost in 25 minutes. In the 1900s in British India, many snake charmers used cobras with the venom removed and the mouth stitched shut. The snakes lived only a short time, while fakirs bought new ones for 2 rupees and could earn about 50 a day. In early 1900s Paris, salons let writers and painters share long pipes with Chinese immigrants for 5 francs a session. Picasso, Cocteau, and Satie visited, and shared mouthpieces helped spread tuberculosis among regulars. In the early 1900s, some American asylums used Benjamin Rush's chair, holding the head in iron and the limbs in leather for up to 48 hours. Doctors claimed stillness would calm the mind, but it often caused harm and is now seen as a dark chapter. In early 1900s Florida, many black men were taken from jail on false charges and leased to turpentine and phosphate camps for a few cents a day. They worked in chains under harsh guards, and death rates in some camps reached about 60% a year. On some southern plantations in the 1800s, enslaved people were made to wear iron punishment masks with bells. The device kept the mouth shut, exposed any movement, and many did not survive long under it. On 4 January 1903, an elephant named Topsy died by electric current at Coney Island before a crowd. Thomas Edison filmed it to warn against alternating current in his rivalry over power systems, a stark blend of science and show. At Coney Island in the early 1900s, the human roulette spun riders in a 12-meter drum at 20 turns per minute until the floor dropped. People stuck to the wall, then tumbled into each other, and the wild ride stayed open for 15 years. In the 1920s to 1940s, a radio hat let people hear broadcasts through a helmet with built-in headphones and a tall antenna. It cost $7.95, weighed about 3 kilograms with the battery, and often lost signal with a loud squeal. From 1859 to 1896, Charles Blondin crossed Niagara Falls on a wire more than 160 times, sometimes on stilts, blindfolded, or with a person on his back. He even cooked an omelet mid-wire and kept walking into his 70s. In the early 1900s, a solar bath put the head in a metal drum and shined ultraviolet light for colds and tired minds. Sessions ran 30 minutes at about 50 degrees Celsius, and fainting was oddly taken as success. From 1906, photographer Harry Whittier Fries staged kittens and puppies in tiny suits with hand-built sets for postcard art. He sold millions and wrote 20 books, yet he died unknown and poor in 1953. In 1893, Louis Boutin made the first underwater photos by sinking a 600-kilogram camera in a copper box to 50 meters in the Mediterranean. He lit the scene with sealed magnesium flashes, needed 30-minute exposures. On 8 September 1900, a storm drove a 4.5-meter surge over Galveston, and the island sank underwater in 4 hours, costing over 6,000 lives. Afterward, the city raised the land by 5 meters. From 1907 to 1910, Louis Brennan's gyro monorail balanced on one rail using 2 fast-spinning flywheels. It could stand still on a wire and lean 45 degrees in turns, but the huge power need ended the idea. On 12 April 1934, Mount Washington Observatory measured winds of 372 kilometers per hour, a record for 62 years. Winters sealed the station in meter-thick ice, and staff carved a tunnel just to go outside. In the 1910s, the ped rail swapped wheels for rows of moving feet that could step across mud and bogs. A few served in the First World War, but crews found the gear jammed with mud and the idea faded despite its bold promise. In the early 1900s, alpine teams used wooden ladders as bridges over crevasses up to 60 meters deep. Roped to ice anchors, the skinny rungs shook in storms and sometimes gave way under heavy packs, turning a simple crossing into a nerve test. In 1910, Romanian inventor Henri Coanda unveiled an experimental jet airplane decades before wartime models. On its first run, it lifted a few meters, hit a barrier, and caught fire, and Coanda then turned to airflow research that led to the famous Coanda effect. Swiss railways built avalanche galleries, long concrete shelters with sloped roofs, so winter slides skim over trains instead of hitting them. Since the early 1900s, they've diverted millions of tons of snow and are credited with saving thousands of lives on alpine lines. Arctic teams in the early 1900s crossed pressure ridges, piled sea ice up to 15 meters tall, made when ice fields pushed together. Dog teams hauled sleds near 400 kilograms, while men cut steps and winched loads up 60-degree slopes. On the 7 October 1903, Samuel Langley's aerodrome fell into the Potomac 3 seconds after a catapult launch from a houseboat. 9 days later, it failed again, and on 17th of December, the Wright brothers made the first powered flight. He spent 20 years on this flapping wing machine with an 18-meter span and a weight of 300 kilograms, flown while lying flat and pulling levers. In tests from year 1900 to year 1915, it climbed only about 30 centimeters, yet he kept trying. This amphibious bicycle from the late 1800s and early 1900s used air-filled pontoons and a pedal-driven propeller, and its maker said it could cross the English Channel in 4 hours. In trials, the push was too weak. The Dynasphere was a giant one-wheel car of the 1930s with a driver inside a 3-meter ring powered from the center. It reached 48 kilometers per hour, but light braking made the driver roll over, and turning was so hard that trials ended after several mishaps. Octave Lapise climbs the Tourmalet on foot, pushing his bicycle while other riders lie exhausted by the road. It is a hand-tinted lantern slide used for lessons, with dye-colored mountains, protective cover glass, worn binding tape. In year 1898, Nikola Tesla showed a radio-controlled boat in Madison Square Garden that moved by wireless commands from his box. Many doubted it and guessed a hidden helper, and officials passed on it, but the idea pointed to modern drones. From year 1896 to year 1912, crews carved the Jungfrau Railway through glacier ice inside the mountain at 3,454 meters, working by hand in -20 degrees with thin air and frequent cave-ins. In the late 19th and early 20th century, circuses staged boxing shows with a kangaroo in gloves facing a boxer. These acts faded by the 1960s as views on animal care changed, leaving a curious page of sports history. From the 1850s to the 1920s, rat catchers worked in ports and warehouses with trained ferrets and small terriers, sometimes trapping up to 500 in one night. Captured rats fed a betting fad called rat pits, where crowds timed the events and placed wagers. Before electric bulbs, people in several places filled jars with fireflies to make small lamps for reading and night work. Some doctors even wore jars as living headlamps, and in Japan, large catches briefly lit simple homes. These were mudlarks, children on the Thames in the 1800s and early 1900s, knee-deep in mud-hunting coins, nails, coal, and bones to sell. In freezing weather, they worked for a few pennies a day, and for many families, this was the only income. Factory pie eating contests without hands were a favorite morale game in the United States from year 1910 to year 1940, with racers tied to chairs and racing face first. Winners earned a day off, and the messy photos often ran in company papers as cheerful team moments. In London, from year 1700 to year 1900, pure finders gathered animal waste from the streets and sold it to tanneries to make leather soft. They worked barefoot and could earn a shilling for a kilogram, but the strong smell kept them out of churches and pubs. From year 1905 to year 1933, Harry Gardner, called the human fly, climbed the outside of city towers with no rope, using tiny brick cracks. He topped more than 700 buildings and once reached a 23-story roof in 3 minutes, 10 seconds. La Belle Irene became the most famous tattooed lady on the Barnum stage, telling crowds she got 460 designs in a single year. In truth, she chose them with artist Samuel O'Reilly and earned about $1,000 a week by simply posing for photos. In the early 1900s, a vibration developer claimed to shape the chest with daily 15-minute electric sessions. Doctors called it modern science, but the usual result was skin irritation and bruises. From year 1900 to year 1940, metal nose shapers promised a new profile without surgery and were worn for hours each day. They mostly left marks and short-lived dents as the cartilage sprang back, an odd chapter in beauty gadgets. Arthur Saxon set a world mark in the bent press in year 1906, lifting 168 kilograms with one arm from a bent stance. At 88 kilograms, he raised almost twice his body weight, a feat still listed as unbeaten. These 1930s electric masks heated a rubber hood to 50 degrees Celsius for 30 minutes to smooth face lines. The warm flush after a session made many believe it worked. On 11 July 1897, Swedish engineer Salomon André and two partners set off for the North Pole in a hydrogen balloon that leaked and was never fully tested. After 65 hours, the craft came down on the ice, and their diaries and photos were found in 1930. Elizabeth Green, called the human pretzel, performed in the 1920s by folding into a wooden box about 45 by 45 by 30 centimeters. Doctors later reported joint hypermobility that let her slip joints out and back without pain. In 1900, explorer Edward von Toll went into the Arctic to find Sanikoff Land, a mirage made by light over sea ice. He spent 2 winters in far Siberia and vanished near Bennett Island in 1902, with traces found in 1903, keeping the mystery alive. Jack Earl, often billed as the tallest man alive, stood about 229 centimeters. He toured with major circuses and appeared in many silent films, turning rare pituitary growth into a stage career. In 1950 to 1951, the Gilbert Atomic Energy Lab sold for $50 and included real uranium ore and a working Geiger counter. It let kids do home science hunts for uranium, but ended after 1 year, mostly because the price was high, not because of risk. At the 1900 Paris Games, a live pigeon event took place, the only time animals were used in an Olympic contest. Belgian shooter Leon de Lunden recorded 21 hits, and public pressure soon replaced it with clay targets. From the 1940s to the 1960s, the Austin Magic Pistol used calcium carbide and water to make acetylene gas that you lit, sending a ball out with a bright fire flash. After many accidents, it was pulled from stores in the 1960s. In 1896 to 1900, public X-ray shows drew crowds who watched their own bones glow on a screen. Clarence Daly tested tubes for years and passed away in 1904 from exposure, sparking the first safety steps. At the Paris Games of 1900, swimmers raced an obstacle course in the River Seine, climbing over boats and diving under floating logs. Australian Frederick Lane won the 200-meter course in 2 minutes, 38 seconds. Bridge builders in the early 1900s walked steel beams only 15 centimeters wide at about 50 meters high, with no harness or helmets, carrying rivet guns around 15 kilograms. In 1907, the Quebec Bridge collapse took 75 workers in about 15 seconds. From the 1910s to the 1930s, human flies cleaned skyscraper windows while sitting on one wooden board hung by a single rope, often in suits and bowler hats. They worked in strong winds high above the street with no harness. The famous 1932 lunch photo was a staged ad, yet iron workers often ate on open beams about 260 meters up. Many were Mohawk men from Canada, known for steady work at height during the steel era, even as jobs were scarce in the Great Depression. In 1898, an undersea cable linked France and Massachusetts, about 5,900 kilometers long and about 9,000 tons in weight. It was copper with gutta percha and iron armor, laid in 6 months through rough seas and fog. On 29 August 1907, the Quebec Bridge fell in about 15 seconds, sending about 9,000 tons of steel into the St. Lawrence. 75 workers lost their lives after weeks of warning cracks were dismissed as normal stress. In 1866, the transatlantic cable cut message time from 10 days by ship to about 7 minutes, but one word cost $5, about 100 today. The first royal note had 99 words and took 16 hours to send because the signal was weak across thousands of kilometers. From 1908 to 1930 in Detroit, early cars often rolled on turns at about 64 kilometers per hour because drivers did not yet understand speed and centrifugal force. Many of those harmed were young children playing in the street. Breaker boys aged 8 to 12 worked 10-hour days in Pennsylvania coal plants, picking slate from moving coal with bare hands for about 60 cents a day. Dust and constant strain harmed many and helped drive early child labor laws in the United States. Around 1910, city switchboards ran so fast that 300 women in one hall plugged and unplugged lines about 1,500 times each hour. 12-hour shifts with no breaks pushed their hands and voices to the limit, powering a new web of talk. Between 1909 and 1916, cars in the United States rose from about 200,000 to about 2,250,000, filling roads with first-time drivers. So many cars flipped turtle on turns above 40 miles per hour that manuals began to teach why speed and sharp bends tip a car. On a 14 April 1935, Black Sunday drove a dust storm 3 kilometers high at about 100 kilometers per hour across the Great Plains, turning day into night in seconds. The air grew so thick that lamps would not light, and people covered faces with wet cloth to breathe. During Prohibition, Rum Row sat about 19 kilometers offshore from New York to Atlantic City, where ships sold whiskey to small contact boats. Fast boats ran at 80 kilometers per hour, and for everyone caught, about 100 slipped through, moving $40 million a year. Fast boats slipped into Portuguese Bend at night, passing crates to trucks in minutes. A local told the Los Angeles Times in 1926 that officers caught only one boat out of 100, and they had no boat to chase. During the Dust Bowl in 1937, families sealed windows with wet cloth to keep out the brown sky that blew indoors. Storms called black blizzards could turn noon into night and cover a room in powder within an hour. In 1919, Boston fireboats sprayed salt water to melt the hard molasses because fresh water did almost nothing. Streets, clothes, and even telephones stayed sticky for months, and the harbor looked brown until summer. From 1750 to 1900, horse-drawn bathing machines rolled into the sea so a woman could change inside and step out through a door facing the water. Attendants called dippers guided her into the waves, and even Queen Victoria used a private machine with a royal crest. From 1897 to 1953, New York ran 43 kilometers of underground air tubes that sped mail at 56 kilometers per hour, moving a letter from Brooklyn to Manhattan in about 4 minutes. In the First World War, homing pigeons carried target notes for artillery, reaching success rates near 98% at Verdun in 1916. After seeing French birds work, General John Pershing started a pigeon service in July 1917. The penny farthing of the 1870s used a huge front wheel up to 1.5 meters, so one pedal turn covered a long distance. Falls called headers sent riders over the bars, and the 1885 safety bicycle with chain drive replaced the big wheel within 5 years. Until 1909, San Francisco allowed opium parlors, and upscale rooms charged $2 with silk pillows and carved wood. An 1880s moral panic led to rules that barred some residents, while others could still visit. From 1854 to 1929, orphan trains sent about 200,000 children from New York and Boston to the Midwest. They waited with number cards as local families chose, and many became farm helpers while brothers and sisters were separated for life. In the early 1900s, hospitals used continuous baths, keeping people in warm water around 92 to 97 degrees for hours or even days in canvas slings. Cold baths of 48 to 70 degrees were tried to calm mania, and fainting was taken as proof it worked. In the 18 and early 1900s, some cities held rat pit contests where a small terrier was timed to clear 100 rats. A handler named Jimmy Shaw said his dog Billy cleared 100 in 5 minutes 30 seconds in 1825. From 1886 to 1903, early Coca-Cola used coca leaf extract that added about 9 milligrams of the active alkaloid to each bottle. After 1903, the recipe used caffeine instead, while still using decocainized coca leaves for flavor today. In the early 1900s, department stores hired living mannequins who sat perfectly still in window displays for 8 hours. They were not allowed to move, speak, eat, or visit the restroom, and crowds gathered to watch for a single blink. In 19th century England, some couples used a public market ritual to end a marriage, with a rope as a sign for bidders. It acted as a poor person divorce since a legal divorce could cost £40, about a year of wages, with cases recorded as late as 1913. From 1818 to 1902, British prisons used a treadmill that made people climb an endless stair for 8 hours a day, like scaling a mountain. Engineer William Cubitt built it to wear them down, and the machine powered nothing at all. From the 1100s to the 1900s, Europe bought ground mummy powder as a cure for almost anything. Demand grew so high that traders sold newly dried imitations, and apothecaries measured it by the ounce to mix with wine or honey. In the early 1900s, tuberculosis clinics put beds on open porches so patients slept outside all year, sometimes in minus 30 degrees Celsius. Doctors believed cold, fresh air would tame the illness, so this was standard care until antibiotics arrived in the 1940s. Victorian buyers traded in real human hair, often collected in workhouses and hospitals, and even taken after death, with pennies paid per ounce. Because styles needed more hair than one head could grow, long, undamaged braids could fetch about £1 an ounce to make wigs and switches for wealthy women. After Waterloo in 1815, traders collected young soldiers' teeth to make costly dentures for the rich. Dentists called them Waterloo teeth, the top source for false teeth, until the 1860s. Ice harvesters cut lake ice into blocks of about 150 kilograms, working in cold as low as minus 30 degrees when the ice was only 30 centimeters thick instead of the safer 45. Some fell into the water many times a season and kept working in frozen clothes while tools were rescued first. At the 1893 World's Fair, Clark Stanley, the Rattlesnake King, boiled a snake on stage and sold the oil for $5 a bottle. In 1917, inspectors found only mineral oil and beef fat. He paid a $20 fine and disappeared. In 1853, people sat with hands on a table for hours, hoping unseen forces would spin it and tip out letters. Researchers later showed tiny muscle moves made the table slide, yet the craze filled parlors across Britain. Some Victorian ear trumpets stretched nearly 2 meters to gather more sound for people with severe hearing loss. Wealthy owners hid the horns inside listening chairs, while others carried large shoulder trumpets that looked like small gramophones. At night in Victorian London, crews emptied backyard pits and sold the human waste as farm fertilizer for about £1 per ton. Workers climbed 3-meter holes and risked fainting from gas while the city slept. In the late 19th century, police rolled a wheeled cage for people taken for public drinking, a moving cell across town. After 2 to 4 hours on display, most were released, a slow walk meant to warn the crowd. In 1929, Spruce Girls modeled swimsuits made from 1mm wood veneer to promote Washington timber. The suits could float but felt stiff, so the idea stayed a short-lived stunt. Some Victorian women slept with raw beef tied to the face, thinking natural enzymes would smooth lines by morning. Shops even sold special face steaks at a lower price, though doctors warned about spoilage and germs. In the mid-20th century, ads showed doctors telling pregnant women to smoke for calm and a healthy weight. Brands paid for these claims, and real health risks were widely accepted only in the 1960s. Since 1889, street sellers sold bits of scrap as pieces of the Eiffel Tower for a franc each. In 1925, conman Victor Lustig even sold the whole tower to a scrap dealer for $70,000, then tried the trick again before fleeing to America. From 1867 to 1974, some U.S. cities enforced so-called ugly laws that banned people with visible illness or injury from public streets. Police detained disabled vendors and beggars, and one newsboy with damaged hands kept work only by selling inside a pharmacy. Until the mid-20th century, families hired professional mourners to weep at funerals and show status. The richest staged a chorus of 20 or more women with practiced laments and ritual gestures. From the 1890s, vendors sold sealed bottles of pure mountain air as a take-home cure. Travelers paid a franc for a keepsake they believed could calm coughs and help breathing into the 1930s. In the 1860s, indoor bicycle schools taught balance on smooth wooden floors that felt like ice. Iron wheels and no brakes meant many beginners fell every few seconds, even as lessons cost $10 for 10 classes. From the 1850s to the 1970s, elevator operators controlled the speed lever, called the floors, and set manners inside the car. In hotels, men lifted their hats for ladies, regular residents tipped about $1, and rude riders could be refused service. In the late 1800s, tiny doses of strychnine were sold as a tonic, said to strengthen the heart and aid digestion. An Olympic marathoner used it in 1904 and barely survived, which shook faith in the craze. From the 1600s to the 1900s, painters used a pigment called mummy brown, made by grinding ancient remains and mixing with oil. Pre-Raphaelite artist Edward Burne-Jones even held a tiny funeral and buried his tube when he learned the source. Since the 1920s, companies hired trained noses to smell armpits before and after deodorant and give a score. Testers sniffed dozens each day and earned high pay, and the job still exists in fragrance labs. From the 1920s to the 1970s, shoe stores used X-ray fitting machines so shoppers could watch glowing bones inside their shoes. Kids loved the glow, but years of exposure harmed many staff, and the machines were banned in the 1970s. Radium spas in the early 1900s sold healing water. People drank up to 3 liters a day, soaked in baths, and even did 35-liter colon rinses. Socialite Eben Byers took 3 bottles of Radithor daily. By 1932, he was fatally ill, and the scandal pushed stricter rules on radioactive cures. From the 1890s to the 1940s, some sanatoria used rail beds that nurses rolled outdoors in any weather, even minus 20 degrees Celsius, for non-stop fresh air therapy. Patients lay for months under many blankets with faces uncovered. From 1100 to 1567, printed indulgences were sold as papers that reduced time in purgatory. Some were even offered in advance for future sins. Johann Tetzel's catchy line, "As soon as the coin rings, the soul springs," helped fuel a controversy that pushed Martin Luther to post the 95 Theses in 1517, launching the Reformation. From 800 to 1600, the relic trade was big business. Churches paid large sums for bones said to be from saints because pilgrims meant income. Sellers often used animal bones. There were enough True Cross splinters to build a ship, and several cathedrals displayed John the Baptist's head at the same time. London's Necropolis Railway ran from 1854 to 1941, taking mourners to Brookwood Cemetery, about 40 kilometers from the city. It used ticket classes for both people and coffins, with daily departures, and over 200,000 carried before the station was lost in 1941. From 1890 to 1930, traveling photographers recorded earthquakes and fires and sold thousands of postcards. After the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, some sold sets of 50 images for $2, turning scenes of ruins into a business. Ether frolics were student parties in the 1830s to 1850s, where people held cloths with ether, laughed, and sometimes fainted with no memory. In 1846, dentist William Morton used ether to stop pain in the first public surgery, helping create modern anesthesia. A famous 19th century baby syrup promised instant calm for teething and fussiness at 25 cents. It relied on heavy sedatives, drew doctor warnings by 1911, and stayed on shelves into the 1930s. Professional dog food tasters chew and spit samples to judge texture, taste, and freshness, often testing about 40 bowls a day. Some earn $30,000 to $75,000 a year because pets cannot explain problems. From the 1870s to the 1930s, companies sold electric belts that claimed to raise male vitality with all-day shocks. They cost $15 to $50, often caused burns and irritation, and were later banned by the Food and Drug Administration as a false cure. At fairs around 1800, people paid a penny to inhale laughing gas from silk bags and burst into loud laughter. Chemist Humphrey Davy held gas parties in 1799, and dentist Horace Wells later used it for the first pain-free surgery in 1844. From 1900 to the 1920s, some ads sold capsules with tapeworm eggs as a quick way to lose weight. People were told to take another pill later to remove the worm, a risky fad with no proven celebrity use. From the 1850s to the 1950s, some hospitals hired patient turners to rotate bedbound people every 2 hours to prevent pressure sores. One worker could handle about 30 to 40 patients per shift, making hundreds of careful turns until pressure relief mattresses ended the job. From 1915 to the 1940s, some beauty salons used X-ray machines to remove unwanted hair by disabling the follicles. The results lasted, but many clients later suffered skin damage and long-term health problems, so the practice faded. From 1890 to the 1930s, famous chefs sold handwritten recipe cards to visitors, often for about $1. The cards were early versions of celebrity cookbooks, and many left out key steps to keep the real method in the kitchen. From January 18 to March 8 in 1943, the United States briefly banned sliced bread to save wax, wheat, and steel. Public complaints were strong, and the rule ended in less than 2 months as newspapers celebrated its return. In 1909, Louis Brennan built a gyroscopic monorail that balanced on one rail using 2 one-ton flywheels, spinning at 3,000 revolutions per minute. It could stand still, lean like a motorcycle, and in 1910 carried 50 riders before the idea was dropped as too complex. From 1900 to the 1960s, portable steam cabinets heated to about 140 degrees Fahrenheit, while the user sat inside with the head out. Marketed as a home spa and cure for aches, they sold in Sears for about $50 into the 1970s, despite reports of fainting and heat burns. From 1883 to 1928, George C. Parker staged fake sales of the Brooklyn Bridge, showing papers and claiming family ties to the builder. Some buyers even tried to set up toll booths before police stopped them, and the saying about selling a bridge comes from his tricks. In the 1890s, many asylums kept people in restraint jackets for long hours, while crowded wards stretched staff and care. Some places had one doctor for about 300 patients, and common therapies included cold baths and spinning chairs. In the 1920s, spiritualism swept America as people visited mediums hoping to hear from loved ones lost in the war. Magician Harry Houdini tested seances and showed the hidden tricks behind moving tables and ghostly shows, and the craze faded. In the first days of the Berlin Wall in August 1961, 77-year-old Frieda Schulze leapt from her window on Bernauer Strasse into a rescue net as East police held her arms. West firefighters pulled her to safety, and about 5,000 people escaped this way before the windows were sealed with bricks. In the 1940s, about 550,000 people lived in American state hospitals, many sent there under loose rules. Crowded wards and hard daily routines later pushed reforms and a move to community care. In late imperial China, palace students used headrests to steady the brush for perfect calligraphy and strict training. Most served in the court, and only a few ever met the emperor. Before radar, Britain built giant listening mirrors to detect airships up to about 24 kilometers away. Operators learned engine notes by ear, and 15 concrete dishes still stand along the coast as quiet relics. In the 1920s and 1930s, dance marathons kept couples moving for weeks with only 15 minutes of rest every 6 hours. Crowds paid to watch as partners swayed half asleep, and public concern over exhaustion led many cities to end the craze. In 1927, Leonid Kulik's team found a fan of fallen trees covering 2,000 square kilometers from the 1908 blast. There was no crater, and the energy was about 15 megatons, a mystery that still puzzles science. Dalit communities in India long faced strict caste rules that kept many outside villages and in cleaning and burial work. Laws and activists have pushed hard to end this bias, though change has been uneven. From 1977 in Buenos Aires, mothers gathered every Thursday with photos of sons and daughters who went missing during the dictatorship. They still search for grandchildren born in secret and placed in other families.